Welcome back to another episode of Liminal Phrames. I'm your host, Nathan, and I'm joined by my friend, co-host, colleague, exceptional human being, Darren King. Great to see you, Darren, in the cabin. I've got cabin vision on right here, and it's really always wonderful to see you in your natural habitat. Things look great over there. I hope you're doing very well. Things are good on my side. Finally on the other end of a very busy work season for me, so things are calming down just a little bit. I'm getting some of my free time back, which is very nice. And the weather is changing, as we always like to discuss the weather. It's changing for the warmer, I think, seemingly. And that means I get to spend more time outside in nature, which I really enjoy. Although on top of that time outside of nature, we have controlled burns in Western North Carolina, which does things for the air quality that I am not a particular fan of, but those things must be done. Nevertheless, it is great to reunite with you and to get into another Liminal Phrames discussion. Before we jump into all that, though, I do want to catch up with you. You have been busy. You have been traveling. You've been speaking. How are things going?
Things are going well. I have enjoyed myself recently. I also am definitely enjoying the warmer weather. Yeah, but speaking of the traveling, I was recently in Austin for South by Southwest, and I have an affection for Texas, so I always like to be back in Texas. I've spent quite a bit of time in Houston, and we'll be back in Houston next month. But this is the first time I've been in Austin in quite a long time, so it's grown a lot since then. I love the spirit in Austin, culturally progressive and interesting and artistic. College town, and it's grown a lot since I was last there. So always enjoy my trips to Austin, even more so when South by Southwest is going on. Had a great time meeting up with some friends and colleagues, speaking on this panel about the nature of reality and just getting to hang out. But at the same time, I'm always happy to get back to the cabin, retreat to the woods, and get back to my usual routine.
Love it. Excellent. We do need those times to recharge. Very, very important. So I hope everybody has time to do that, find time to recharge and rejuvenate. With that said, let's get into some recent topics. I want to touch on some things, and we didn't do as much of that last episode, but I do think it's worth discussing a couple of items here. So one, it's been about a month now since the disappearance of General McCasland. For those of you who aren't as familiar, I think our audience are routine listeners will know the story here, but General McCasland was one of Tom DeLonge's advisors back when he was considering launching To the Stars Academy. He was connected with McCasland and other folks to steer him, guide him, advise him on how best to do a rollout for a disclosure push. And we've never really had any public statements from McCasland about this, as far as I'm aware. But the emails from John Podesta that were leaked in the WikiLeaks disclosure showed an email from I think it was Podesta and talking about McCasland with Tom DeLonge. They alluded to that connection. So it's a legitimate thing that really is true and happened. And McCasland has a history of involvement with a lot of top secrets, special access programs, reverse engineering programs. He has a scientific background. Anyway, he's retired and lives out, I think, in Arizona, and he disappeared, really just up and disappeared. And no one has seen him or found a trace of him. Really odd disappearance. And time has gone on, still no sign of him. But in addition to his disappearance, we have come to find there are other individuals that were within his orbit over the years, colleagues of his and those he would have sort of rubbed elbows with, who have also disappeared. And so now we're getting into some more conspiratorial territory that I think is concerning in the lightest, but also deeply disturbing in the worst. And so, Darren, what are your thoughts on that? How conspiratorial should we be with this disappearance? What do you think's going on there?
Well, I think when he first disappeared, I was just reserving my opinion until more information came forward. But since that time, a lot of time has passed, and the fact that he has not shown up, there's no trace of him, is, I would say, beyond suspicious. I would say at this point, the, I think, fairly parsimonious answer is that this may very well be related to some of his activities in the past, maybe related to the fact that there has been this push among a certain segment of the government to perhaps declassify information. And so if you think about the gatekeepers historically, I can understand that they might want to get ahead of the curve and remove from the scene, if you will, the chess pieces that might be problematic for them. And McCasland certainly stands out as one of those, possibly because not only does he have the information, it's definitely that we think would suggest he does have information they would be concerned about getting out. But in light of what you just talked about with DeLong and whatnot and TTSA, and the fact that he was cooperating with DeLong to supposedly present disclosure to the younger generations, suggests that he's someone who might be very pro-disclosure. And so from that point of view, it certainly seems very, very suspicious. And as you pointed to, it's not just him, actually. It's other people as well. And I want to quote something from the New York Post here that discusses some of these other people. This is something I read just today. Quote, Melissa Casillas, who worked with her husband as an administrative assistant at Los Alamos National Laboratory, famous for developing nuclear weapons during the Manhattan Project, has not been seen since she dropped lunch off for her daughter in New Mexico last summer. Same part of the country, by the way. She is one of 4 high-clearance people who have died or gone missing since June 2025 with connections to UFO-linked retired Air Force General William McCasland, who vanished last month, according to the Daily Mail. So that's from the New York Post. Certainly concerning, I would say. And again, I think the fairly parsimonious answer here is that it probably is likely related here. And I say that partly because people say that while, yes, he's a senior and retired, he was in very good health, physical and mental. He's used to going hiking in those hills. He had a good relationship with his wife and just disappeared one day. And they haven't heard anything, nor have they recovered remains or anything in a kind of fairly desolate area where there's not a lot of brush to sort of cover someone's remains if something happened to them that was a natural accident of some sort. So my take is that this is probably related. And this is, I think, a good wake-up call for all of us, because as much as we like to talk about this as an entertainment kind of topic, there are real repercussions here for our society, for disclosure, and for the degree to which some of these people might go, again, from the gatekeeping campaign, to prevent this from happening. We can talk in a minute about Matthew Brown's comments also, which were pretty disconcerting and troubling and sobering. But let me ask you first, when you think about what's happened with McCasland and the cast of characters around him and similar disappearances, what kind of conclusions do you lean towards anyway?
Yeah, I do think there's something off here. The fact that there's the lack of real physical trace of McCasland, and I want to make a correction. I think I said Arizona, but I think it's Albuquerque, New Mexico. Like you said, a pretty wide open landscape there, but no real sign of a physical trace of him disappearing. He seemed to be competent, comfortable in a hiking condition. I've heard one report that he had taken his revolver with him. The revolver wasn't found at the home, but of course his cell phone was at the house. Really, really strange behavior for someone with his background. And just because you're retired from a military role that like the one that he held doesn't mean that he doesn't have secrets, right? So this is really concerning from a state secret standpoint, that this individual just completely fell off the face of the earth. I would think there would be a lot of agencies very concerned about what he knows and who might have gotten a hold of him and what they might be doing with him. So, if you want to talk about a conspiracy of a foreign state actor being involved here, it's concerning. But other than that, there are a lot of other conspiracies that are on the table, I think. And perhaps he disappeared himself. Perhaps he needed to get, off the board, so to speak, because of some sort of impending threat that he felt he was under. I also have thought about the idea that his disappearance and his prolonged disappearance and profile, although I think it has been picked up by the mainstream media, maybe not quite as loudly as you might think, but drawing attention to him, to his absence by association, draws attention to the topic. And that is interesting, really interesting, because it could draw more eyeballs to this and make it something that is more peculiar for the masses. So I am concerned about it. I think there is a pattern here, and we certainly heard over the years there have been patterns of intimidation tactics of people who have been killed. David Grush has alleged people have been killed as part of the cover-up of legacy program activity. I'm surprised as well we haven't heard from Tom DeLonge. I would have thought we would have heard a public statement at least about this man that he had seemingly a good relationship with. So a lot of questions, not a lot of answers, and it is very concerning. I do hope we get some. And you alluded to Matthew Brown. Matthew Brown had a discussion with Jeremy Court-Bell and George Knapp and discussed the real concern, the real fear that whistleblowers have of retaliation, of retribution for sharing what they know. And I think that's a legitimate concern. I think that the gatekeepers, the legacy gatekeepers, aren't without their own tricks and their own power, and I don't think they should be underestimated. They have been doing this a long time, and they're quite good at it. So I would be curious to get your thoughts on that. I don't know if you've heard any other whistleblower intimidation stories, but we keep hearing from the notable mouthpieces that whistleblowers are waiting in the wings. They're coming, they want to talk, but then we end up not really hearing about who they are. So is somebody basically muzzling them through these kinds of activities? And does McCasland's disappearance have a similar downstream effect? Hey, think about this before you come forward, because we can make you fall off the face of the earth without a trace.
That's a good point. And I also want to bring up the possibility that, related to something you said earlier, I guess we also have to consider the possibility that he went into some sort of witness protection program, that because he does know so much, maybe, again, preemptively, who knows what's happened, but it's certainly suspicious either way. Now, in terms of Matthew Brown's comments, I thought those were very interesting and definitely disconcerting, and the implications stretch far beyond the UFO conversation, because what he was describing was how there's this upper crust of people that seemingly the usual laws of the land don't apply to them, and that this has been operationalized basically on a mass scale so that there's just incredible corruption going on behind the scenes. And, we were warned decades ago about the military-industrial complex, and you think about how much it's grown since then and how much there's been a weaponization of psychological warfare. And I saw someone make a point about, almost humorously, of course, that the mainstream media will acknowledge that the CIA has been a bad actor in the 50s, the 60s, the 70s, the 80s, the 90s, the turn of the millennium, but probably now they're fine, right? It's almost like this lack of acknowledgement of the historical record. And these are not good actors, and they are in bed with each other, so to speak. And so it really is sobering for us as Americans, I think, to think about what's going on here, what our tax dollars are being used for. And Matthew Brown mentioned that every morning he cries. And he said not primarily for his own situation, although that's definitely challenging. He lost his job and struggles to get by, and his wife has these medical issues on top of that. But he mainly says that he really wrestles with the future of our civilization. And he has this sense that if we don't unite and stand up to this behemoth, that it's going to be too late. But of course, you and I both know, and we both talked about this before we started recording, that the incoherent nature of the current political situation and the divisiveness in our culture, which again, you have to ask questions from a psychological point of view, a psyop kind of point of view, how much has that been engineered so as to make the populace so easily controllable? So these are real concerns. And I think, again, we need to step outside of our usual fascination with the UFO topic and ask deeper questions about the future of our civilization. And as I made a comment on social media about this, I think we need to really stop and somberly reflect before we sort of join forces in any kind of token operation. We need to really ask some deep and troubling questions around what can we do? What are the options here moving forward?
Yeah, I'm glad you brought that up. I think it is really worth our time and thought reflection on that question. What can we do? What kind of impact can we make? And assessing that landscape as well as your own personal capabilities. What are the actions that can be taken that you should take? And I think everybody needs to consider their own safety and their family's safety. There are so many factors at work here, but there's also the important consideration of the health of our civilization and maintaining a good outlook on the world and developing your own personal, sort of hygiene, spiritual hygiene, so to speak. It has a rippling effect, just like the effect that where you go onto social media and you doom scroll, like that has a rippling effect into your life and the lives of those who are around you. So I think we do need to be careful about what kind of food, what kind of, media we are ingesting, because it does contribute to the health or disease of our bodies, of our civilization. And obviously that affects this topic in a very powerful way. I know we want to get into some other topics here. There's a lot to cover, and kind of where we left off from the last episode was talking a little bit about the different beings that may be involved with reality, with interfacing with the layers of reality, and what role do they play. And of course, if you're following this topic at all, you're familiar with all kinds of beings. We talk about them all the time. We talk about gray beings that are aliens. We talk about the angelic beings, the orbs, and these sort of interdimensional beings. And there's a whole sort of a cornucopia of entities that we can get into. And you've got different takes from many different folks on what the beings are and what role they play in our reality. And in fact, even today, we heard from J.D. Vance that he's settled everybody. These are just demons, apparently. So case closed. You and I have talked about that subject quite a bit. But I think it's important to say that we're not being dismissive here either. Like, that is an important take. It is worth exploring, but we want to get into all of that on this episode and cover that territory in the way that we know how. So Darren, why don't you set the table for us? How would you like to proceed in tackling this ontology of beings?
Well, to pick up on what you were saying there, we definitely hear many different takes, and what's often not part of that conversation is the assumptions, the axioms that preface those perspectives. And we often, as you pointed out, most recently with J.D. Vance saying that he doesn't think these are aliens, he thinks they're demons. We've heard people like Chris Bledsoe before saying things like, these are not aliens with ray guns, they're angels. So we have this binary framing over and over and over again. And yes, I think anyone who listens to our show knows by now that we've kind of railed against that one-dimensional kind of framing. We've tried to paint a more complex picture with plenty of nuance. But what this ultimately leads to is questions about the nature of reality. That is an expression, the nature of reality, that we've said 10,000 times on the show, it feels like, almost as many times as the word discombobulating. But this is where you end up going. And I think it would be worth tackling this in terms of different ways that beings can be produced or beings can be presented in our awareness, because we know there's this interesting intersection between our consciousness and what reality is. And we've spent time, as well as other people like Bernardo Kastrup, Don Hoffman, who we've referenced, have made the case that how something emerges in our awareness, we have a role in that. There's a participatory kind of cosmos here. And even when something emerges as a being, seemingly, versus just an awareness in your own mind is an interesting conversation piece, something I'd like to get into later. So we're going to walk this through in steps here, and I want to delineate at least three main categories of beings that have different relationships with reality, if you will. But I also want to make the point, as I often do, that each of these beings, each of these kinds of experiences are, in the most fundamental way, equally real. We're not questioning the reality. The only times people really ask, was it real? Was the experience real? Are the people who are coming with a physicalist perspective on reality. And what they mean, therefore, is, was it physical? Was it part of consensus reality? But we have made the case, as many others have as well. In fact, you and I talked about this before we started recording. There's been a lot of progress. There's much more open-mindedness now to different reality structures, explaining everything. And when that's the case, you're better off asking, as I like to say, whether or not something is experienceable rather than if it's real, because there's a question about the virtual nature of this reality altogether. So let me describe the setup for this episode when I wrote digging into the ontological status of beings, in quotes there, in contact reports. Persistent agents, symbolic projections, or dynamically instantiated interfaces. What are we actually encountering? We could also ask a follow-up question, what kind of tools could we bring to bear to even delineate these differences? Now, I think some people will be very familiar with persistent agents. That's what we assume a being is. People will also be fairly familiar with the idea of symbolic projections, a kind of Jungian perspective maybe. But I think dynamically instantiated interfaces will be a strange expression for some people. We'll definitely have to break that down. But before we jump off here, I just want to hand it back to you for your reflection on how these kinds of questions have been primarily and perhaps most substantively informed by our questions around the nature of reality more than anything else.
Yeah, I can only think to my upbringing, my religious training, those traditions which gave me both a permission and a lexicon to discuss the sort of ontological status of these kinds of beings. So in my Christian tradition, my historical Christian tradition, angels were talked about, the nature of God. Was Jesus a man? Was Jesus divine? You get into these interesting discussions that bridge a lot of the same territory, and that landscape was easy for me to sort of then shift over onto the landscape that we find ourselves in with ufology, and so with encounters with alien beings, quote unquote alien beings, with angelic beings. I'm putting quotes around all these kinds of things because that's an interpretive grid applied to that encounter with an other, some sort of other. And we're encountering others all the time, right? I mean, you're an other, I'm an other. It's just that we have buckets that we are more familiar placing them. And so you are just fellow human like I am human. That's a very simple bucket that we use all the time. And we never question that. We never question, sort of the ontological status of you just being another fellow human to me, right? Just as we take that very much for granted. But we certainly could question it, right? We could question really the otherness of those that we encounter and our own otherness as well, right? How familiar are we with even our own selves? And what do we take for granted about our own selfhood that we bring with us into sort of our narrative storytelling every single day? When you wake up, I am experiencing the world as this individual, as this agent called Nathan. I have this shared history that I seemingly can stitch together, and that helps me paint a picture of where I've been and what I'm trying to do today and where I think I might be going tomorrow. There's a sort of linear time progression aspect to that as well. But when we encounter others without a placeholder, right? When I encounter some other being that has no placeholder in my lexicon, well, I have to do something with it. I have to map it onto something. And so typically we go to things like mythology. We go to the imaginal realms. We go to fantasy. We kind of come up with these other approximate categorical places to put them. And with those placements come their own frameworks and baggage that then adorn these others with qualities. They bestow on these others with qualities that are associated with those familiar categories. And then we just walk away and say, yeah, I had an encounter with an angel, right? I mean, so you can see how we dramatically flatten the experience just so that we can begin to make sense of what that encounter is like. And so, I want to say all that because I want to hopefully it hints at and it points to the complexity of these kinds of encounters with others. And ultimately, not only does it showcase the complexity of those encounters with the others, but it highlights the complexity of the encounters with our own selves. And what does that mean? What does it mean to be embodied, to be a witness, to be an experiencer, an observer in the world? And does that give me some kind of special ontological status that is different from, say, and a rock or a tree or another being? Is there, in fact, a degree of separation between these different things that I have categorized, or is no separation exist at all? So there's a lot of stuff we can get into there, and I think it really fits well into this conversation.
Absolutely. And just for the audience's sake, I'm not at all offended if Nathan wants to question my ontological status. That's fine. I'm okay with that. I feel pretty grounded myself. But these are good questions you're asking. And speaking of McCasland, by the way, this is fascinating. This came up in an interview I did on Third Eye Drops earlier this week, because we know that people like McCasland were the ones supposedly that told Tom DeLonge and members of TTSA that if they wanted to understand the phenomenon, they should look at Greek mythology. It's very interesting. I've been rereading Lavenda and DeLonge's work recently, and they talk a lot about that as well. And of course, that begs the question, why would that be relevant? And I think we both want to set the table with here is that we're not denying the aspect that people do slot into demonology or into spiritual beings, nor are we denying the fact that the idea of space aliens is part of the picture or interdimensionals. What we're saying is that these all, though, get recontextualized in, I think, a more helpful way when you have a bigger frame to work with. And I think that's what we want to unpack today and describe for people. I think also something that came up in that interview as well, reflecting on a conversation I had with Carl Nell and things that Carl Nell has said in general, where he's talked about it being one thing to be raised in a circle like you were, where you have a certain metaphysical framing about these other kinds of beings and different levels of reality that are intersecting with ours that you would run into in a Christian framing, for instance. But he has talked about in public forums that it's one thing to have that as a conception of the world. It's something else entirely when you're confronted with direct evidence or an experience with that other layer of reality. And what he seemed to be suggesting, and it's certainly the case when I've talked to him, that this is something that is involved in disclosure. It's that ontological shock. It's that shift from even religious people who are raised to believe this. It's one thing when it's an abstraction. It's something else entirely when you're asked to think about it and how we should perhaps even shape policy around the intersection with these different elements of reality. So truly fascinating. Now, speaking of reality models, I think it might be helpful to describe what we tend towards. And you brought up before we started recording, thinking back to when I first talked to you about idealism several years ago now and how there has been more traction in that way since then, including people in our audience who over time have said this particular podcast, gratifyingly, has been helpful for them to make that shift. But of course, in general, we've tended towards idealism, this notion that mind is behind reality, that reality is fundamentally mental or experiential in nature. But I would want to point to cosmopsychism as an even more definitive way of making sense of things in a way, because it's a subset of idealism that I sort of tend towards. And like idealism, therefore, it accepts that reality is mental primarily. It adds, however, that mentality is unified at the cosmic level first, with individuals deriving from it. So I would also add that individual choice, which is an experience we have, going back to what I said earlier, don't ask if it's real. Don't ask if free will is real. Ask if it's experienceable. Do you have the experience of exercising free will? That's a more helpful discussion piece, I think, that can be meaningfully engaged with rather than whether these things are real, because nothing is quite real the way we were taught growing up. So I would say that even individual choice is a subset of a larger series of nested movements. And in many ways, for a human being, and I've talked to you about this before, we have certain palette to work with experientially, and we have the emotional feeling of making a decision. But as we've talked about before, there's now scientific evidence that shows that the body basically knows a decision has been made several seconds prior to us having the experience of thinking we've exercised agency and made a decision, which is very much comporting with ancient non-dual traditions that talk about awareness arising within us from a deeper level of reality, if you will. So this is what we're talking about. And when you talk about it from that frame, then it makes sense that rather than asking, again, in a kind of a binary way, is there a spiritual realm and then sort of the earthly plane? Instead, you look at many, many nested layers. layers that go horizontal as well as vertical. And that if reality is primarily mental, meaning dreamscapes within dreamscapes, then I think that is incredibly enchanting, but also incredibly complex, because it means that basically anything that can be conceived of, anything that can be dreamed, becomes a reality of one form or another. And of course, this also plays into how, as we've said many times, this notion that reality is out there, separate from us, something we can observe and study, is torn apart, basically, with the revelations that have come out of quantum physics. We understand now that the observer plays a participatory role in what renders as reality. And as you and I have talked about recently in recent episodes, that might even be reflected in the way that certain genetic substrates tend to allow certain kinds of anomalous cognition or experiences to arise. But even there, genetics might be downstream of deeper energetic intentions prior to this realm. So before we sort of dive into the different layers of beings and unpacking those, I just want to turn it back to you to reflect on that really convoluted, complicated, but also kind of fascinating picture.
Yeah, it is complicated. And I think I'm going to dip back into the mythology component that you alluded to there. We have a lot of different pantheons in our religious traditions. And you can, I think it's a good example to use, because you can overlay those pantheons on one another, and you can find a lot of similarity. You can find a lot of mapping from one god to another across these different pantheons. And so, we might all look at that and go, what that means is they all had a common ancestor, a common origin in that idea. Another way to look at that would be that these archetypes don't necessarily require a common origin, but are really more or less movements within reality itself that become personified as these beings within these pantheons, within these mythologies. And so I don't think either take is wrong. It just highlights what you're getting at here. There is a lot of overlap. There's a lot of layering to using this way of thinking about how forces interact with our realityscapes, and how we come away from those interactions, adorning them with a kind of personification, and that personification has a degree of persistence, just like you and I believe we have a degree of persistence from day to day, and so I find that very interesting. It also makes me think of a book by Neil Gaiman called American Gods, where he kind of explores this concept where the gods are in fact real, quote unquote, real entities that can dwell on the earth, but they lose their efficacy, their power, when people begin to forget about them. When people stop believing that they're real, they lack an ability to interact with reality. They essentially can fade away into nothingness with that loss of memory in the human family. So that idea, I think, also holds a lot of weight within the framework that we are alluding to. It raises lots of questions for me, and I wonder if I'm going to throw one at you, because it gets at this issue of persistence, and I am curious your take on, can we ascribe to these beings a level of persistence, that they have a constitution that is persistent regardless of time and space, or are they more ephemeral, for lack of a better term? Are they less permanent? So I'm curious what your thoughts are on that. How can we think of them? Can we think of them in that way?
I would say that there are different levels, from my perspective, of persistence to these different beings. I think one aha moment for me outside the construct and these different experiences I've had was recognizing that, well, number one, even from a non-dual perspective, impermanence is the norm. The impermanent nature of reality is something that is a key aspect of what Buddhists and Hindus and any kind of non-dual teaching basically talks about. And again, cosmopsychism points out that the one fundamental and really only enduring aspect of reality is this one original mind, which is what we actually really are. So anything else, whether it's Nathan or Darren or the lady or a gray alien is to some degree a subset of that, and to some degree a temporary subset, although I really always want to point out here, and again, it does get complex, because when you have these experiences outside the construct, many of the parameters that we assume are the things that we work with and make sense of reality don't apply outside of that construct. So time really doesn't exist outside of this particular frame. So it doesn't even make sense to really ask, how long does this thing persist? Because time is one of the parameters that we use here. It's almost like you think about, again, as a software engineer in my background, you will choose different data structures and different programming languages based on what you want to do and the way that they're different data structures. In other words, the different structures, how they host information that you can then use and interact with. You will choose one programming language and a data structure over another, depending on what you want to do. The problem is here we assume that this is all there is. We assume this is ultimate reality, and we assume, therefore, that we have to make sense of things in terms of space and time. But as I've said many times, and as others have said before, it's definitely the case that even quantum physics is showing us that space-time is not foundational. It's an epiphenomenon. So one of the biggest challenges I think people have to incorporate here, and the biggest humps to get over, is recognizing that landing this, grokking this within a frame of space-time is not what we're really after. We're after something deeper and prior to that. So I think one of the things we will break down today is how, number one, everything is an instantiation arising out of that oneness. I would also point out that anything that does instantiate in a way is permanent in a different way, because nothing really passes away, right? These are all dreamscapes. It's almost like you play a video game, for instance, even with a bunch of different characters. You could play a multiplayer game, and at the end, some characters die, some characters win, whatever. But you know how it works. You can dial up and watch that entire thing again whenever you want. This is a notion of multiplayer games that can be reinstantiated. And I've talked recently about how, again, what the conundrum of black holes taught us is that all the information that could instantiate the 3D rendering of the black hole and everything that's fallen into it can be stored as information around the rim of the black hole. This seems to be just the case with reality in general. So if you had a particular pet that you really loved when you were a little kid, you can still reinstantiate that pet. And to some degree, there's no reason why that instantiation can't continue to have a certain kind of existence. But I just wouldn't talk about it in terms of space and time, because those are not really the fundamental parameters. Now, speaking of what you brought up, I'm glad you brought that up, because I wanted to bring to the picture here the notion of tulpas and egregores, which we've talked about before on this podcast. And again, this is where we see this intersection between psi phenomena, between paranormal and anomalous kinds of things, apparitions, but also the UFO phenomenon, which isn't to say, again, that they're all one thing. We're going to show some different layers here. But the idea of tulpas and egregores speaks directly to what you talked about with American Gods. So tulpas and egregores sit in an intermediate zone within the symbolic projection category that we're going to unpack. But at the far end, where projections acquire relative stability, persistence, and quasi-agentic structure. So here we're delineating. You can have agents, but you can even have quasi-agentic structure. Because a tulpa can be framed as an intentionally cultivated symbolic construct that through sustained attention and iterative reinforcement becomes a semi-autonomous process within an individual's cognitive architecture, no longer experienced as fully self-authored, yet still rooted in that system. An egregore extends this dynamic across multiple participants, so it's more than one person's mind, where shared belief, attention, and symbolic alignment stabilize a distributed pattern that can exhibit continuity independent of any single contributor. In both cases, what begins as projection undergoes a kind of informational consolidation. The quote-unquote entity is not a pre-existing agent, but neither is it a fleeting image. It becomes a self-maintaining pattern within memory, behavioral tendencies, and interactional coherence. This places them at the boundary where symbolic projections begin to approximate dynamically instantiated interfaces, or even weakly persistent agents, depending on how much continuity, independence, and cross-context stability they exhibit. So this kind of gets at what we're talking about today. And some people, again, might be confused. Some people who are tuning into Liminal Phrames for the first time thought they were going to hear about aliens and space aliens, that they assumed were biological creatures just like us. And the assumption there is not even brought up as a question, is that they would therefore have agentic, existing, and sustaining kind of permanence to them. But even with tulpas and egregores, we see examples of how even the human mind, which is itself a nested layer of the original mind, with intention can instantiate new levels of reality, even use semi-permanent agents. So I'll pass it back to you to consider that and what that means in terms of an implication for the UFO phenomenon.
Yeah, well, there's a lot there, and I think I'll need a transcript just to go back through some of it because it was really good. I wanted to get some examples here, and I'll throw some out. You can tell me maybe if I'm hot or cold with some of these, but we can start with the gray alien itself as an example to some degree of approaching that egregore type quality, because for crying out loud, there's an emoji of an alien, right? So this concept of a gray alien has a life, has a kind of persistent quality that spans many different minds across the world, and it has qualities, it has aspects to it that we would look at. We without even having to ask each other, we can go, yeah, I know it's kind of short, it's got the big eyes, it's a little bit creepy and unsettling looking. Like, there's some things we can ascribe to this entity that I don't have to have had a quote unquote physical encounter with it to know what that experience is like. Right. So I want to throw that out as a first one. I was originally going to give you Santa Claus, but I'm going to give you great alien instead. So what sort of status would you give this type of being? Would you classify it in an egregore category here, or something else entirely?
Well, that is a more complex question than it might first seem, because, and this has been talked about in the experiencer community, because the gray alien is a typology that is seen in many different iterations and forms and derivations. So there's the quintessential gray alien that, as you said, has been part of our cultural zeitgeist for some time now. Maybe most precisely came on board with the front cover of Communion. Certainly, we think about the X-Files lore that you and I grew up with. That was central to that. So there's the cultural aspect of it and how it's taken on a life of its own beyond the original experience that people have had with the beings. And then often, again, this comes up in experiencer discussions because some people will say, the grays, don't trust them, there's nothing good from them, they're deceptive, blah, blah. And someone else will say, I love the grays, and the grays that I've interacted with, like in Jeff Silver's case, taught me about Advaita Vedanta, and they gave me non-dual understanding, and they helped promote my spiritual awareness. And you ask yourself, are these people talking about the same beings? Maybe, maybe not. And again, it gets even more complicated, because to what degree are different people, which we see as agents, rendering different versions or accessing different versions? So if you think about casting a fishing line into the water, you might pull up a different fish and think you're talking about the same fish, but maybe you're not. And on top of that, the particular fishing line you use and how you cast it, all of that plays a role too. This is really complex stuff. But to this point, let me read the definition of what is a persistent agent, the first of the three categories we're going to talk about, and I'll discuss how gray aliens fit within that. So persistent agents refers to entities that are assumed to have continuity of identity across time, there's that tricky word again, interactions and contexts, independent of any single observer's perception or specific contact event. In this framing, a being encountered in a report is not a one-off appearance or transient construct, but rather an enduring locus of agency within its own stable patterns of behavior, memory, and intent that persists beyond any particular interaction. This implies that repeated encounters are with the same underlying entity rather than reinstantiations or projections, and that the consistency in communication style, claims, or responses reflects an ongoing internal state rather than situational generation. Under this view, the contact phenomenon is analogous to interacting with a relatively autonomous system that maintains continuity of operations over time. There's that tricky word again. Even if the observer only accesses it intermittently through constrained channels of perception or communication. So that's the definition of a persistent agent. Now, again, I want to remind everyone that within cosmopsychism, which is a subset of idealism, the notion is that everything arises from the one original mind, and therefore, to some degree, everything is only virtual beyond that original mind. But it's also important to remember, because some people want to argue that we're a simulation based in a real physical reality in some alien mainframe somewhere. Well, the point is, as Tom Campbell has pointed out, there are no physical realities. Physicality is just an experience set. And you and I have talked about this. I've seen even experiencers who don't like this idea that maybe their experience points to idealism or cosmopsychism as a fundamental reality structure, because they are still assuming that physicalism is the norm, and they want to see the mainstream, the government, the press, their neighbors, their family say, you are right, they are real, they are physical. And they mean all these other things that are not said, but are assumed. Now, it becomes even more interesting because we today are mostly talking about different layers within the phenomenon. But then you think about something like the machine elves that people encounter through DMT experiences. And one of the most interesting aspects of that has been the most compelling and has made people ask questions about reality is that different people seem to encounter these same machine elves. These same figures seem to show up as if they have an ontological permanence to them, independent of what we're dreaming up. Remembering, though, that everything within this model is dreamed up with an original mind, but it's layers upon layers upon layers. And so if different people can access the same machine elves, or they go 30 years between DMT trips, and then machine elves go, hey, you're back. It's so great to see you again. And they pick up like they never left off. I even read something recently about someone who said that machine elves were upset with him and abandoned him from the DMT realm or something. This becomes really fascinating, and there are interlocking, mutually supportive ways these structures come into being and are held together in some ways. So again, the point being that any kind of being we're talking about today, including the Nathans and the Darrens of reality, are derivative of original mind and several steps down in terms of these different layers. And as I've been talking about recently, again, it came up in that interview recently, in a way, the 3D realm that we're part of, this really dense layer, even in occultic practice and esoteric understanding, this is actually the most dense layer and the least energetically potent. So you and I were raised to believe, again, within conventional physicalism anyway, that this is the barometer for what's real. And this turns it completely upside down and says that this is the most illusory realm, even though it feels the most dense, which is really interesting. So within that, I would say that there are many different kinds of gray aliens that would fit that tab, basically fit that description. And again, because it has become part of the cultural zeitgeist, it takes on a life of its own or extends its life beyond the original parameters. But I would definitely argue that this is one of the beings that probably is best described as a persistent agent, remembering, though, that it's still derivative under the one original mind. But in other words, they would be the same category of being as us. And this, I think, also explains why there is a layer compatibility around genetic enhancement and taking genetic material and creating hybrids, because we're all within the same sort of mental substrate where these shared rules or data structures are compatible.
Yeah, that's really helpful. I mean, if you're talking there, I was thinking about this idea of a kind of resonant suspension within original mind. And so there's a stickiness within original mind to certain ideas, information sets agentic combinations that have a persistent quality, and they have a resonant, so they're suspended within original mind itself and have that kind of stickiness to them. And that is you, that is me, that is these other kinds of persistent agents that you're alluding to. But as you've hinted at, you talked about directly, even this is a projected process that echoes throughout mind itself, right? So it's not an activity of original mind and it stops there. It's that persistent agents themselves have projected resonance suspended agents of their own, and it goes on and so on and so on and so forth, right? It keeps going down. It's sort of all the way up and all the way down within this typology. And so it's really, really interesting. Like you said, it's difficult to wrestle with this because it is like trying to grasp hold of a dream state that you have. If anybody has had that experience, and hopefully everybody has, where you had that dream and it feels incredible, and you're waking up and you want to hold on to it. It's like, I'm going to remember this. I want to tell somebody about it, and then no matter how hard you try, sometimes that dream just slips away, and it doesn't have that kind of strong resonant suspension persistence. It doesn't have enough of it. But there are other dreams which have incredibly strong suspension and stickiness, and they will stay with you throughout your life. And so that's I think a good example of what we're talking about here. That there are these habituations of mind, but again in a little different way, that create kind of a habituated process that has a life of its own, and it continues on and has a very persistent quality. So it's really, no one's really talking about these beings in these terms. And I think that is what I find to be quite frustrating, because, and I get it, I totally get it, because we want to be able to, just like I go to a zoo, I want to go to the zoo and see the different beings in their environments and interact with them. But not every being has the same quality as a being like you or I or a great alien. Some of them exist at different layers of this original mind, of this construct. So I think that it's really difficult, but just because they exist those different layers doesn't mean that they lack agency or ability to sort of cause a kind of action on the world, on quote unquote reality. That they still have an ability to interact with reality per se, but they don't exist in the same way in which you and I would, or a gray alien would, for example.
That's a good way of putting it, that stickiness, that habituation that kind of creates some semi-permanence. It's interesting too, because we definitely want to apply this to us as well. And we think about famous stories that have been part of our zeitgeist, like Lord of the Rings, for instance, the entire world of Middle Earth that J.R.R. Tolkien described, which partly came out of his experiences in fighting war and whatnot. But of course, his ideas were based on Norse mythology that he read when he was a kid as well. And I've talked before about this, and I remember you and I had a conversation over pizza about this, famous cases, for instance, where people will be accessing subtle layers of reality, and then they create certain ways of making sense of those subtle realities, and, for instance, ascribe certain Sanskrit letters to different layers of subtle reality. And then people, centuries later, will access those same subtle reality layers and now see projected over those layers those same Sanskrit letters that were only ascribed several centuries ago in another accessing of a subtle layer of reality. So the point is that it keeps being creative. This emergent aspect of reality keeps happening at different layers and more subtle layers. And we, as much as anything else, play a role in that because, to your point earlier, we are instantiations of original mind, and not just slices of. But again, this is where David Bohm and Carl Pribham's work comes into the picture, because there's a holographic-like nature to reality. So every slice is actually a lower defined rendering of everything. So inside of Nathan is the universe, and all of the different universes, if you want to put it that way, all the dreamscapes, all the potentiality of that. So in a very real way, we are the mind of God, and we can just as much, but maybe to a lower definition, can create worlds, can create characters. This happens. How many people grew up reading Harry Potter, and this shapes their experience of reality as much as anybody they actually know? People start writing fan fiction because they feel like they know these characters. In a very real way, they do. In a very real way, they are real. That's what we're getting at. Like everything, including us, and even the beings that we conceive of as basically creating us through a genetic picture, whatever, that's a kind of mythology. The idea that humankind was a seeded species, but that's the data structure, that's the sense-making that is part of our picture. But it itself is part of the sense-making within that dreamscape. Just like when you have a dream, different rules apply. You can fly across the ocean because the same rules of physics don't apply. So this is, I think, so fascinating because when you think about this, some people at first are a little bit overwhelmed by it. They're a bit unmoored by it because we're used to thinking there's something sort of righting the ship that we can say is absolute and permanent. In a way there is, if you want to say original mind, there's nowhere you can go beyond that. But everything else is basically a virtual reality, a virtual creation, an instantiation of a temporary existence, including us. But we are all of these things. We ourselves are distributed across these different layers of reality. All right, now let me turn to the next one, and I want to get your take on this, because we first talked about these permanent agents. Again, permanent within a certain frame of reference, of course. Now we're going to talk about something more subtle, and this speaks to symbolic projections. So perhaps a Jungian perspective comes to mind here. So symbolic projections can be understood as structured, meaning-laden manifestations emerging from psyche-level processes, either individual or transpersonal, rather than encounters with fully autonomous, externally persistent agents. In this frame, the being, quote-unquote, is less an independent entity and more of a dynamically organized expression of underlying cognitive, archetypal, or informational substrates shaped by expectation, culture, and latent semantic content. The apparent coherence, intentionality, and even resistance of such figures do not require ontological independence as we tend to think about it. They can arise from deeply layered pattern generation processes that operate below conscious awareness, yet maintain internal consistency. At higher levels of complexity, this can include transpersonal fields where symbolic content is not reducible to a single individual's mind, but still does not resolve into a discrete, enduring agent, producing encounters that feel interactive, novel, and epistemically other, while remaining fundamentally projectional in origin. So that's the second kind of being we're talking about here. More subtle, less permanent, less agentic, but still having an interactive capacity to us. So symbolic projections speak, if you will, to that aspect of beingness.
Yeah, I mean, tell me if I'm way off here, but I mean, this sounds to me more or less like something like the feminine quality of God in a way, or sort of this nurturing aspect. There's a nurturing aspect to reality, just like there is also a destructive aspect or modality to reality. There's an organizing principle and a chaotic principle, and we attribute to these things, a kind of personification, but they aren't really persistent agents in the way that we would say, there's a mother God, right? Like it's too nebulous. It's not concrete enough, but there is absolutely this sense in which there's a nurturing motherly quality to existence that interacts with existence. And so tell me, am I right there? Am I wrong there? Am I getting close to something that we're talking about? What do you think with that one?
Yeah, this I think would apply to, for instance, even when we talk about historical figures like the lady, the being that was interacted with at Fatima, for instance. So here we have questions around the agentic nature of this being. And to what you just spoke about, this relates to what I described last time in our last episode, when I said that her appearance, right, her feminine nature, her feminine qualities are as much, if not more, of the communication, of the curriculum than what she actually says. Because so much of what we internalize and understand about reality and respond to is subconscious. And we don't necessarily say, I feel so much more comfortable, therefore I'm going to take what's being said here differently. It's going to land for me differently than if someone who looked like a Norse god or something of a very masculine nature was showing up in front of me. But it does impact us. And so there's a symbolic aspect there where, even as we've said before, people like Chris Bledsoe end up hearing other people saying to him, maybe this is Sophia, this is a personification of Sophia, or they speak as if Sophia is an actual entity, when of course, even within scriptural tradition, as you and I both know, Sophia is seen as a personification, a kind of contextualization of that aspect of God. Of course, God being an aspect of a certain notion of original mind, the more creative, agentic aspect of that original mind. So you see layers within layers within layers. So what we're sort of getting at here is that this is much more a gradient than its hard delineations, and that this can happen up and down the frame. And I think reality just becomes so much more interesting when you start thinking about it this way. But when we think about these different religious figures across time, for instance, take as an example, the Mother Mary. So there's this historical figure, we presume, most people presume, that actually gave birth to this human being known as Jesus of Nazareth. And then there's the whole question around, was this a virgin birth, which of course parallels what we hear about with women today, end up being impregnated by some sort of source that is not human. This also shows up in aspects of our ancient scriptural traditions as well. Women are suddenly impregnated with something that ends up being a giant, something that seems to be a combination of two different things. And again, I want to point out there that what's interesting is I was just reading about this again today and reading the first volume in the God's Man and War trilogy from Lavenda and DeLong, who we brought up earlier. They talk about there's a certain kind of entity in a certain tradition that is usually a light being, but can take on the instantiation of a physical kind of structure and can pass on DNA in such a way that a human woman can give birth to a being, one of these giants. But they are interestingly described as going back and forth between being a light being and being something more substantive, what we usually call real, quote unquote. I even think about the blue beings that have been discussed before in R.D. Sixclair Clark's work, as well as in other traditions as well. Same thing there. They describe that they themselves at one point were a terrestrial species, and at some point they found a way to be beyond physical structure, beyond biological agents, but that they could go back into that kind of frame of reference, and often do for the sake of humankind, because that makes them more easy to relate to. So even there, we're seeing sometimes we have beings that are within the same sense-making structure as us, to the degree to which something like genetic compatibility becomes a thing. But there are others that even stretch that and become sort of these bridge components where they are light beings, but also have the capacity to translate, just like you would from Python to JavaScript. You can take one particular data structure and apply it to another one. In a similar way, they can be a light being or a biological being within our sense-making structure. I just think this is so fascinating, because whether we talk about a character in Lord of the Rings, or we talk about a notion of God, or we talk about the lady who's the personification of the feminine aspects of God, which we recognize in the yin and yang underwritten across the cosmos itself, these are all storytelling elements that instantiate in these different world structures. And we ourselves are not just the experiencers of it, but we are authors of it. We are co-authors. It's happening as we speak. And writing these stories, creating topos and egregores, demonstrates that we actually have this capacity, because we ourselves are like holograms of the original mind.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, the image here of movements in an orchestral piece comes to mind here as well. Like there are grand movements in that piece that have a quality to them that we would go, aha, like that's a movement. You know, that is a clear creative process taking place, has a form, it has a structure, it has an impact on the experience of that orchestra, of that piece of music, right? So these are movements of original mind in a way that or habituations of original mind that maybe aren't quite as I hate to use this word, I'm going to use it, localized. They're not as maybe discrete as we might be as persistent agents, but they are what certain aspects, what certain movements of mind look like as it does certain things, right? And they have a quality to them that has a form. Essentially, it has a type of form that we kind of symbolically overlay onto that and say, this, is the bridge. This is the act of creation. This is the act of destruction. And we can recognize that movement of original mind. And we tend to personify it, but it really isn't a person. It doesn't have personification in the sense that we do, and being as discrete and kind of more suspended habituations than that. I don't know, that's something that came to mind, an image that felt useful to me.
Yeah, it's interesting to think about art actually as an expression of that original mind creativity. And I think art is probably something that reminds us of that more than anything else. And it's also interesting too, just thinking about how that could apply across the board. So for instance, one of the ways that this topic is confounding to many people from the mainstream is when you take, for instance, the common humanoid form that shows up over and over again, whether it's a gray alien or a human or a humanoid or a reptilian or a Nordic or whatever, right? This shows up over and over again. Now, again, you could argue, and it's true, that it's a certain instantiation within a certain sense-making kind of structure. And from that, but downstream of that is the notion of perhaps these beings are genetically compatible. But that becomes part of the downstream sense-making. This idea that even when we think about the personification of the gods, or with the way that we picture the gods, or the fact that we are made in the image of the gods, do we mean that first and foremost as a kind of genetic downstream aspect of that? Or do we mean as a sense-making kind of medium, that this becomes an aspect of the story that repeats itself? Now, you think about something like the Apple ecosystem. People, either Android people or Apple people, right? And of course, one of the things that Apple has been able to monetize so successfully is not just one or two devices. It's over our entire lifetime, Nathan, going back into the 80s, where they have created an entire ecosystem where these different devices are not only useful in themselves, but they synergize with each other. They sync up really well, take on a kind of life of their own in a way, right? They become an ecosystem that becomes an extension of our life. So you think about ecosystems in nature, and you ask yourself now, are the digital ecosystems we're creating anything other than just the next instantiation as co-authors of original mind? It becomes really interesting, even when we think about how we're giving birth to AI, but in a very real way, you can think of us as a kind of biological AI from a structure that predates and is sort of beyond us as well. All right, so now I want to get into the last of the three, and this will be one that kind of requires some unpacking, I think, because it's going to be something people are unfamiliar with. So this is the dynamically instantiated interfaces. So these can be framed as context-dependent renderings of underlying processes that are not themselves inherently beings, quote unquote, but appear as such when filtered through perceptual, cognitive, and environmental constraints. In this view, the encountered entity is an adaptive presentation layer assembled in real time to mediate interaction between fundamentally non-isomorphic systems. An example would be human cognition and an external or transpersonal source. What such an interface would be doing is translating, compressing, and structuring information into forms the experiencer can engage with, while simultaneously constraining, modulating, or gating what can be perceived or exchanged. Its apparent intentions, guiding, instructing, probing, or even deceiving, can be understood as functional outputs of this mediation process rather than intrinsic motivations of a standalone agent. The form, behavior, and coherence of the quote-unquote being are thus co-generated, optimized for intelligibility and interaction, and dissolved once the exchange no longer requires that specific configuration, leaving not a persistent entity, but a completed instance of an interface-mediated communication. So what do you think about that particular framing of a quote-unquote being?
Wow. Yeah, that's a lot there. So, man, you should have given me the definitions in advance, because I would have loved to pour over these because they're really good. So I'm thinking of almost like an informational packet. Like there's like kind of a download of information here. It feels like a good map for me, where there is, depending on the situation, there is something that is rendered or received by the percipient, me in this case, just as an example, that it takes on a kind of tutelary quality. It's instructive to me, and it emerges in a way from my own perception, like a void, but it emerges as a whole. It emerges as a holistic thing that is prepackaged and that I can absorb, and that transforms something within me. Like I ingest this information, this interaction, and it has this transformational impact upon myself. And then just as quickly as it arose, it also disappears. And it's like that creative, almost like the creative impulse, like that arises within a person. And, you're like, well, where the heck did that come from? How did I get this idea? But it arrives fully formed without you putting it together like you're assembling a Lego kit. It arrives, as a holistic thing. So I don't know. Am I hot or cold there with that? Does that sound like it's on the right track?
Yeah, and I know that you and I have had a conversation about this before, and I remember you saying this is almost like a maintenance agent or a process in an operating system kind of thing. And that is the way I look at it. I look at it like a sub-protocol, if you will, in a system, and it's performing some sort of function, but here it's not performing a function out of a sense of independent agency that it wanted to do something, for instance, but it's arising as an instance of the system itself maintaining the system somehow. So I'll need to break this down a little bit, because what I would suggest, and again, I've had this kind of epiphany being outside the construct and sort of seeing this, and again, it fits with non-dual traditions. It fits with a certain way of thinking about a simulation kind of hypothesis. The notion is that at a different layer, a deeper layer, a higher level, a more potent layer energetically, the idea of the human experience is dreamed up. And so consciousness, which is, of course, at the deepest layer, one thing, constrains itself in such a way as to have the experience of not just being human, but being Nathan and being Darren. Now, we are operating within a system, therefore. We are operating within a rule set that executes. Again, this fits with quantum physics and the understanding that reality looks a lot, and this is where the simulation hypothesis is becoming so popular, because this looks like a rule set that's waiting to execute, which doesn't indicate kind of primary foundational reality. But what I would suggest is that, to some extent, we, at a deeper, higher level of reality, chose to have this experience, but we are both the characters in the play as well as those who wrote the play at a different layer. How could we not be, right? Because we're all coming from the oneness. But to create an interesting play, it ends up being like a dynamic multiplayer game where the system has to also respond to what the individual players do, right? The avatars in the game, what they do. And sometimes there has to be cleanup, there has to be reorganizing, there has to be ways that the aspects of consciousness that are determining and holding the system in play so that it's maintainable have to intercede and intervene. That's going to be a bit of a preview there for the next POC episode coming up next week. But this is the notion that because this is a construct, but it's not a set in stone construct. It has to be malleable to some degrees. It has to be porous to some degree to allow for agents of consciousness, which we are, to make decisions which change things, because we still are authors at this level. But because of the complexity that arises in the system, there are sometimes ways that consciousness beyond this particular construct has to intervene to clean things up, right? We think about back in the day, you'll remember this, where we would defrag our hard drive, right? It's actually a function you would click on, because over time, a bunch of junk accumulates on your computer, processes that are half finished and those kinds of things. Think about it like that these agents come in, but they're not really agentic in the way that we're talking about here, or we were talking about these other kinds. They are basically processes. They are functions of the system to maintain the orderliness of the system, because you have to find this sweet spot between a system that's open-ended enough for novelty to emerge. That's the whole reason we do these things, is for novelty to emerge. But it can't be so adaptive to novelty that it collapses the construct. In other words, if too many people gather that this is actually not real the way we think it is, it would inevitably actually collapse the construct. So what you're trying to do is find that sweet spot where you hold it in play enough that novelty can emerge, and you actually even steer it in subtle ways. And the UFO phenomenon, at least one aspect of the UFO phenomenon, which is more than one thing, plays that role. This is the control structure I would suggest that Jacques Vallée talked about. When we have the airships showing up that look like not something from the distant future, but something 30 years ahead of what was arising in 1890, that's being done to inspire and steer the civilization in a certain way, just like black triangles and whatnot are for us today. So to me, this particular kind of beingness, this dynamically instantiated interface, speaks more to the maintenance of the construct than it does to specific agency of real beings as we often think about them.
Yeah, that's very helpful for me. It's like a lattice of potentiality. Like it has a structure to it, kind of like a webbing. Think of a different analogy here, a webbing or a netting that is porous, but has a clearly observable, sort of landscape feature set, and it also kind of corrals what is possible, what is not possible, what things can it contain, what things can't contain. And it provides it's a kind of parameter set in a way for the possibility space. And so when you bump up on those against those kind of boundary conditions, it pushes back on you to say, well, it can't quite go further than that. Like we're going to give a little bit of pushback here, and keeps things on rails, because without a degree of order and structure, there is no ability to really create novel experiences. Like it's just kind of disjointed information that has no organizing quality. There's nothing to feel good about or bad about, because it's completely random and chaotic.
Absolutely. And when we think about the games we like to play, same thing when we play D&D. We've talked about this before, right? There's a certain coherence to it. And if it was completely wide open and there's no rules to it, no boundaries to it, it would be no fun. And what's difficult for us to reckon with is the fact that this is the very same thing. The things that we push up against, like disease and dying and deterioration and the loss of people we love, the loss of pets we love, those kinds of things are the things we wish weren't part of our experience. And yet, we've talked about this before, if you are a being sitting within original mind, which is just pure potentiality, not even the possibility of lack, which I've experienced outside the construct, what do you dream up as something that would be interesting to you? It would be finiteness. It would be limitation. It would be the novelty that could emerge because differentiation is tied to limits. The limits are what create the rules that create all the games we love to play. It's just interesting that we have a hard time applying that same understanding to this experience itself in the day-to-day.
Yeah, constraint makes it all worthwhile. So I think, if we're honest with ourselves and reflect on that, we understand that to be very true. That these experiences, these meaningful things that we look at in our life, that we say, hey, that was impactful, that made a difference. It it came with its own set of constraints. So yeah, it's very applicable. I think people can certainly catch that one. Is there? I'm going to throw a question at you here. Is there any limitation to the structure? Is there any limitation to the possibility space? Like, or is it more or less? Is it spun up and spun down on its own accord in its own quote unquote time, and then it has a new instantiation and a new possibility space and ad infinitum, right? Or is it sort of? I mean, I guess this is really semantic in one way. It could just always be one thing. But what are your thoughts there? Is it something that winds up and then winds down, or is it in perpetuity where the rule set does change or morph? I hate using it again, but over time, there's a morphing quality to it.
This gets really tricky to talk about because within different non-dual traditions, for instance, there's ways this is made sense of. Speaking of kind of a trajectory of progression over time, I have spoken before about the notion of evolution and involution. So evolution is actually the drawing back into the oneness. So this emergence that arises, the emergent nature of consciousness, which tends to create structures and identities that are more broad, deeper, right? These expansive senses of self where we start thinking we should defend not just our rights and our family's rights, but everyone's rights, human rights, animal rights, the rights of the biosphere, even notions now of plants' rights, people talking about the rights of AI, right? Like these all emerge because of this sense of, wait a second, I don't think I can draw the line where I used to anymore. And it ends up with this kind of cosmocentric perspective where you actually want to protect and benefit the whole because you recognize everything is actually just consciousness. So that's evolution until eventually it merges back into the oneness again. And then you have this notion of involution, which is the spilling out from that oneness into the myriad forms. Now, in some notions, that happens one time, that kind of shift, right? And once you get back into the oneness, that's the end of the story. It's the happily ever after, right? Everybody was one giant conglomerate after that. But there are other traditions that would say that this is a cycle, that this is ongoing. There's even some people who'd say that the compound nature of this, the form and the formless, and the interacting dynamic action there is a very unstable equation. It's constantly wanting to push apart and pull together like two different kinds of magnetic operations. There have been times where, again, after I've been outside the construct and realized all this, it is interesting when you come back in because you not only still have the experience of being Darren, this particular agent that seems to have some degree of persistence, but you also simultaneously will start having memories flood in from aspects of you that are definitely not Darren, but you don't differentiate them. They just come in as memories because, again, speaking of data structures, in JavaScript, you have an array, you have an object, certain things you can use. So here it arises as my memory of something that's happened to quote unquote me. But the question is, what is me there? It's a different layer of me. And I think, again, what's so fascinating and compelling, and I think encouraging at the end of the day, is even when the world feels incoherent and overwhelming, this is just one storyscape. This is one possibility space we're exploring. And what we truly are is something beyond all of these. And what I found when I came back into the construct was, number one, I had to spend quite a bit of time just adjusting to that reality, or that unreality, if you will. But then I said to myself, I'm going to live into this. I'm going to really play the game to the nth degree because I have nothing to lose and everything to gain. That's what really is at the heart of every game we play.
Okay, well, I'm going to land the plane here with our audience. So what do we do with all this information? How does this apply to where many of us are, and many of us, while we want to have these conversations or want to listen to our show, we're interested in the movements that are taking place in our world as they relate to this unveiling that we call disclosure, this revealing of a deeper layer, deeper nature of reality that is hinted at in all of the encounters that we've talked about over the many episodes. So how do we incorporate this understanding, this viewpoint, and overlay that onto what we see in this story that is unfolding in front of us?
Well, I would say that when we think about those agents that have some degree of permanence that are on the same level as we are, like for instance, the Greys that seem to be agentic creatures. Although again, within the story structure, the subplot that they are part of in terms of this larger story, they are not as individuated as us. There's more of a quote unquote hive mind. We might reject that or not feel good about that. Might be concerned that they're going to try to turn us into a hive mind. There's a recent series that is all about that, right? But the notion there is that's just two different sort of games, and you create this sort of hybrid game, to use that term, where you have a bit of both. And again, it's about exploring a possibility space. So up until this point, you could argue that humankind has only been interceded with and intervened by these beings at the periphery of our awareness. And now we may be entering a stage, ironically, coming out of a physicalist kind of framing of reality, which was the most limiting, perhaps, of any in the history metaphysically of our species. But now we're not only having to grok this notion that there's other biological beings that play with the same rule set as we do in that particular game, but that some of them seem to be hybrid creatures that can bridge from a different, more expansive game to this particular game, and some beings that don't seem to be part of this structure at all, but they still somehow, in the same way that in the Marvel universe, you'll have these intersecting aspects of the different universes. In a similar way, these spiritual beings kind of fall into that category. So for me, at the end of the day, I think about it in a couple of different ways. One is that I don't want to suggest at all that this means it's all rosy and sunshine, because just like a deeply traumatic process in your life or something you're reflecting, something that's trying to find some sort of awareness and then integration and evolution will sometimes emerge as a nightmare. And the nightmare experience is not fun viscerally, but it can still be informative and it can still help give rise to a new possibility space. So I'm not even trying to suggest that this is all fun times and we're just going to hang out with these other beings and we're going to form this new structure. Every story has to have conflict and the way that you resolve that conflict. It wouldn't be interesting without it. No one wants to read a story with no conflict and conflict resolution. So we are in the midst of that. We're in the midst of having a conversation, not just about these beings being here, but what this even means about what our story is in the most overarching sense. And for them as well, that they, I would argue, and this comes up in the story, in the subplot, that they are interested in human beings because we have emotions and they want to learn from that and gain from that. And part of the story is they somehow lost their emotions and they have interbred with us to bring that back into the picture. And then we have this notion of in the future, there being these hybrid beings, even the ongoing augmentation and tweaking of the human structures. Why? So that new interesting possibilities can emerge. So in the most overarching sense, I would look at it that way. I would suggest other people look at it that way, which isn't to say it's all fun times, but it is interesting. And at the end of the day, when you're outside of manifestation, that's exactly what you want, with all the spice, which includes what we tend to call here the good and the bad within space and time.
Yes. Embrace the spice, embrace the friction. It's important. And that this implicit order is being made explicit is just part of the way it unfolds. And for us to be comfortable with that dynamic movement, that movement of consciousness is paramount. Instead of getting antsy and frustrated, we can certainly feel those things, but ultimately being at peace with this is part of the movement of experience as it truly is. This has been a great conversation, Darren. I've really, really enjoyed it. I know there's a lot more territory here that we could cover. I hope we get to do that again soon. And maybe there's a book in here somewhere. There may be some material that would be worth putting pen to paper, and I certainly would enjoy reading it. We thank all of you for listening to the show. It's been a real pleasure, and we look forward to spending time with you again soon. May the quality of our questions, shaped by a desire for understanding, enhance our journey of discovery. And may our travels broaden the sphere of our consciousness, reminding us that new discoveries beget new horizons. As always, adventure awaits. We'll see you next time on Liminal Phrames.